Today, I'll be continuing the streak I started last time by reviewing the classic, mostly noir film, The Naked City. I can only say it's mostly noir because, well, descriptions fall short. Let's just get on with it. The story about the story. Along with plays and books, one of the biggest influences on the history of cinema is, quite simply, photography. After all, motion pictures are literally exactly that. A series of still images captured and then played back in rapid sequence to fool the eyes into perceiving motion. Even in the age of digital photography and video games, that fact hasn't changed. The very first films were nothing more than pictures in motion, a proof of concept and a novelty, rather than a format for telling a story. I bring this up because The Naked City has what's very much a documentary feel, and documentaries developed their style during the very origin of film itself. See, motion pictures have something of an issue which still pictures don't have to worry about: editing. Any film which is more than a single take has to be edited, which means lying, in some sense, to the audience. This was especially true back in the early days, since film reels were only so long. Then there was the other problem: developing a narrative. School books, reference books, they can get away with not using a narrative because of their format. You can flip to the page you're interested in, read the information you're looking for, and then close the book and put it away. But a movie, you had to watch it from start to finish. Projectors and film reels were too expensive for most people to enjoy private viewings, and it would have been a chore to find the exact spot you're interested in, even if you could get the rest of the audience to agree to let you hunt it down. Thus, non-fiction films had to have a coherent beginning, middle, and end, and they had to appeal to a mass audience to recoup the costs of filming. One early documentary subgenre relevant to today's film is known as the City Symphony. These films, mostly produced in the 1920s, portrayed the rhythms and the bustle of cities which were then exploding in population. The filmmakers would capture footage of people going to work, going to have fun, and just generally filling the streets in a constant ebb and flow. Standout examples include Manhattan, about New York City; Berlin, Symphony of a City, about Berlin; Rien que les airs, about Paris; and Man with a Movie Camera, which spotlighted 3 Ukrainian cities along with the filmmaking process itself. The man behind The Naked City, Mark Hellinger, is exactly the sort of person you might have expected to come up with it. Born and raised in New York City, Hellinger became a journalist in 1922. The following year, the New York Daily News assigned him a Broadway gossip column. But instead of doing that, he started writing vivid short stories about life in New York. They proved so popular that his editor let him continue. By 1937, Hellinger's columns had nationwide syndication, and Jack Warner tapped him to write the screenplay for the hit film The Roaring Twenties. Hellinger would later go on to write and produce several more films, the last of which would be 1948's The Naked City. Unfortunately, Hellinger had a bad heart, and it killed him at the tail end of 1947 at the age of 44. Still, he lived just long enough to see a screening of the final cut of his film, and as sad as his early demise is, he at least picked a great film to go out on. The story. The movie begins with aerial shots of New York City, and Mark Hellinger himself introducing the film as its narrator. He names the writers, the cinematographer, the director, Jules Dassin, and the lead actors. He also explains that the film was shot on location in Manhattan, including all of the interiors, and everyone you see in the background is a native New Yorker, whether they be extras or just locals who wandered into a long shot. Hellinger sets the stage. 1 a.m. on a hot summer night. and we move from one person to another as they sleep, work the graveyard shift, or enjoy a late evening out. We also see two men chloroform a woman, strangle her, and then dump her in her bathtub to drown. By the way, this is worked seamlessly into the montage. I should also add that we are meeting the main characters of the movie in this montage without any sort of fanfare. They're just some of the millions of people who live in New York. The montage moves on to the morning, and we see that one of the two murderers from earlier is having second thoughts. As a result of that, the second, larger man knocks him over the head with a 2x4 and dumps him into the ocean. Also, a baby cries. An old Irish man makes breakfast while singing a song. A young father says goodbye to his family as he leaves for work. Schoolgirls gossip as they climb on board the morning train. And a housekeeper starts her day by finding the body of her employer floating in the tub. The police get the emergency call, and an ambulance, the medical examiner, technical services, and the homicide squad are all called in. Specifically, the captain of homicide puts that Irishman from earlier, Lieutenant Dan Muldoon, in charge of the investigation, and Dan appoints the family man from earlier, Jimmy Halloran, as his assistant. They meet the team of police already at the apartment, and hear that Jean Dexter, a former department store model, was found dead by Martha Swenson, the housekeeper. Dan gets upset when he finds out that Martha moved the body before the police arrived, and when Jimmy finds a bottle of sleeping pills under the bed, he suggests that she might have died of an overdose. However, Dan tells him to let the medical examiner do his job. Sure enough, the examiner notices burns left by the chloroform and bruises left by the struggle, along with white foam around Dexter's mouth, which proves she drowned. Jimmy finds some men's pajamas and asks the housekeeper about it, and although she's quite distressed, Dan manages to get her to mention Mr. Philip Henderson, an older gentleman from Baltimore, who visited Dexter on a few occasions. The medical examiner then hands Dan the ring Dexter had on her, and the housekeeper mentions that it's a rare black star sapphire, which her brother sent to her from India. They then look for her jewelry box, but it's gone. Dan sends Jimmy off to track down the sleeping pill prescription and visit her workplace, and the movie rather methodically works through the process of visiting each place in turn and asking everyone about Jean Dexter. Jimmy meets the druggist to find the prescribing doctor, Lauren Stoneman. Back at the apartment, Dan gets 2 hairs from the technical services staff, which has turned the bedroom upside down, and the housekeeper mentions Frank Niles, another male friend of Dexter's. After another cut, Jimmy meets with Dr. Stoneman, but it's a dead end. The good doctor knows Dexter took both uppers and downers like too many other young women of the day, but he only met her for one appointment. Jimmy then goes to see her former employer, whose complaints about Jean Dexter are almost word for word what they were in the LA Noire case, and he also meets Ruth Morrison, Dexter's friend, who hasn't heard of any Mr. Henderson. Later that day, Frank Niles comes down to the station. He tells Dan that he's in the textile business, and Dexter was a good friend who modeled for him on occasion. He also mentions he was a Marine in the South Pacific, 77th Division, and for reference, Frank is a much better liar in the film. Dan mentions Ruth Morrison, while Jimmy has brought her in for an interview, and Frank claims he barely knows her. However, when Ruth comes in, she says Frank barely knew Jean, and that the two of them are engaged. Time passes, and Dan lets Ruth go but has someone follow her. He also checks up on Frank's other claims and confronts him about how he was never in the Marines, and his business is nothing but an empty office and a tax dodge. So Frank admits that he gets his money from gambling and insider trading, but he insists he didn't kill Jean Dexter. His alibi at least checks out, so Dan lets him go. He also assigns a total of 6 men to follow him. With all their fresh leads played out, the police start brainstorming to figure out where to look next. And Dan brings up J.P. McGillicuddy, his pet name for an unknown party. The medical examiner's report had just come in, and it revealed that 2 men had to have killed Dexter, since there were handprints on her shoulders. A woman stops by who claims that she can break the case, but she turns out to be insane, so they just humor her for a bit and let her leave. Jimmy heads home for the evening, and he and his wife get into an argument over whether they should physically punish their son for crossing the road unsupervised. He doesn't want to do it, his wife doesn't want to do it, and lucky for Jimmy, he gets out of it when he gets a call from the station and has to head back over. The call was for Jimmy to join Dan to speak with Gene Dexter's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Batory, who just got in from New Jersey. Mrs. Batory says she hates her daughter, repeats it over and over, probably to brace herself. But of course, she breaks down completely when she sees the body. Dan then takes the parents for a ride down to the shore, and once they've calmed down, he asks them about the star sapphire ring and the brother in India. Sure enough, turns out that Gene was an only child. The next morning, a body is found floating in the East River, and one of the men following Frank Niles spots him selling a cigarette case to a jewelry shop for $600. Dan checks it against the jewelry stolen from Dexter's apartment, but it doesn't fit. Another cop suggests looking at the big list of hot items stolen in the past year, but Dan considers it a long shot. Frank would have to be crazy to sell a stolen item in the middle of a big murder case. Meanwhile, other detectives are tracking down the men's pajamas, the ring, and Dexter's address book. That afternoon, a grocery boy confesses to the murder, saying she needed to be punished, and he should be punished in turn. Dan asks him where he hid the knife, and the boy says they'll never find it. So Dan tells one of his men to call the local psychiatric ward, and forgets about the whole thing. The pajamas turn out to be another dead end, but at 7:30 that evening, the cop who checked the stolen items list comes in with good news. Turns out the cigarette case was stolen from Dr. Stoneman. On top of that, Frank used the money to buy a one-way ticket to Mexico City. Even better, it turns out the star sapphire ring was also stolen, and originally belonged to a Mrs. Hilton. Dan and Jimmy go to see Mrs. Hilton to return her ring and ask about the robbery, but before they can get any details, her daughter shows up and turns out to be Ruth Morrison. Much like in the case, her parents divorced and she kept her father's name. It's at this point, however, that the detectives look at Ruth's pearl engagement ring, and Jimmy discovers that, like everything else connected to Frank Niles, it's stolen property. Dan, Jimmy, and Ruth drive over to confront Frank, but when they hear the sound of a scuffle, they barge in and they find Frank laid out on the floor. Dan and Jimmy spot someone fleeing down the fire escape and trade gunshots, but nobody hits anything. Jimmy chases the man to the elevated train, but then loses him. Back at the apartment, Frank comes around and claims to remember nothing about the attack, saying it must have been a burglar who just happened to use the same methods as what killed Gene Dexter. When Dan suggests the burglar stole something, Frank panics and checks his luggage, but then discovers his expensive cigarette lighter was in his pocket. Dan grabs it, and Jimmy checks the hot list, identifying it as property stolen 3 weeks ago. Frank continues to claim he's innocent, even as Dan confronts him with all the stolen items and the plane ticket. A ticket which Ruth didn't know about. Desperate, Frank claims he got it all from Gene Dexter, including Ruth's engagement ring, and so she starts slapping him for either being a thief or lying about Gene, or both. The next day, Jimmy comes in with a hunch. Peter Bacalus was the corpse found in the river the day before. He died just a few hours after Dexter, and he served 2 years for stealing jewelry from pawn shops. It's a long shot, but Jimmy begs, and Dan decides to let him waste some time on the angle. It takes him all day, but Jimmy tracks down Bacalus' arresting officer and finds out that he worked with a partner named Willie, a big guy who escaped arrest by throwing a chair through a window and diving through it like an acrobat. Also, one of the stolen items was a harmonica, so he's probably a player. Dan decides Jim might be onto something, so he gives him 2 men to help out, and they start checking all the gyms and booking agencies in New York. Eventually, they find a wrestling gym whose owner recognizes the description. Willie Garza is the man's full name, but he disappeared a few years back. They know his brother lives on Staten Island, so they go see him, but all his brother knows is that he lives somewhere near Williamsburg Bridge, which connects Brooklyn and Manhattan. He also tells them that the newspapers took Willie's photo a few times back when he wrestled. Jimmy spends all evening and most of the next day canvassing the neighborhood, looking for anyone who recognizes Willie. And meanwhile, Dan has brought Mr. McCormick in from Boston. McCormick bought stolen jewels from Frank, and he has a letter of introduction to prove it. A letter written by Dr. Stoneman. Dan confronts Frank once again, and he's not gonna take his shit anymore. So, Frank finally spills the beans. Henderson is Dr. Stoneman. Back on the streets, Jimmy finally finds a corner store owner who recognizes Willie and says he lives somewhere on the same road. At the same time, Dan and Frank go to Stoneman's office, and after a bit of trickery, like what's in the case, Stoneman immediately breaks down and admits to everything. Stoneman and his wife threw parties that would get rich people out of their homes. Frank and Dexter arranged everything, and the 2 other men committed the actual robberies. Like in the case, Stoneman tries to jump out his window, but unlike the case, Frank and 2 other men manage to grab him and prevent him from doing so. This whole event gets Frank to finally admit the names of the robbers, Bacalus and Garza. He also mentions that the murders were all Garza's idea. He killed Dexter and Bacalus to get a bigger cut of the loot. Back with Jimmy, turns out that he's decided to confront Willie without any backup. He tells Willie he's there from Bellevue Hospital and that Bacalus told him where Willie lives. But Willie attacks him, since that's not something Bacalus knew. Willie steals Jimmy's gun and then gives him a rabbit punch to the back of the neck, letting him live because he knows killing a cop would land him in even deeper shit than what he's already dealing with. Dan finds out about Jimmy just in time to start a manhunt for Willie, and Jimmy comes to just in time to chase after Willie himself. Even so, Willie manages to lose himself in the crowded streets, but with the manhunt on, he's too nervous to blend in. He bumps into a blind man and his seeing eye dog, and in a panic, he pulls his gun and shoots the dog, announcing his location in the process. The police chase him onto the Williamsburg Bridge walkway and manage to surround him, so he runs up the staircase of one of the towers. Dan orders the other police to stop chasing Willie since he has no place left to run, but when he tries to talk Willie down, the thief responds by shooting at him. The police fire back, Willie gets hit, and he falls to his death. The movie ends with another montage of all the faces we've come to know, and in the film's final seconds, Hellinger utters that most famous of lines. There are 8 million stories in the Naked City. This has been one of them. Final thoughts. The line between fiction and nonfiction is a lot more vague than many people seem to realize. It feels like scientific facts should be indisputable, that history should be clear from what we can see of its consequences, and that pictures and video cannot lie. But none of these things are true. The world isn't perfect, neither are humans. One of the earliest documentaries was Nanook of the North, created by Robert Flaherty in 1922, which supposedly followed an Inuk man and his family as they tried to survive in the Arctic Circle. The surviving film is actually Flaherty's second attempt at a documentary on Canadian Native Americans. The footage from his first trip into Canada literally went up in smoke when he dropped a cigarette on his very flammable film stock. Perhaps because of this, Flaherty didn't exactly show the literal truth in his second film. The protagonist's wives were not his actual wives. The hunting scenes were performed with spears and harpoons instead of the rifles and shotguns the locals preferred, and the igloo interior scenes had to be filmed with part of the igloo removed, since the camera was too big to get in and the interior was too dark for filming. Oh, and the protagonist's name was not Nanook, but something that's admittedly hard to pronounce. And, unlike what Flaherty would later say, he did not die of starvation, or because a polar bear ate him. He died in his bed, of tuberculosis. Now, arguably, Flaherty was staging these events in order to depict the truth of living in the North, a truth which was otherwise impossible to depict, what with the bulky, tripod-only cameras he had access to. For that matter, we constantly have to compensate for the effects of cameras in any kind of production. The camera adds 10 pounds, as the saying goes, and between the lights and the white balance, people can look pasty and sick on camera unless they wear makeup that darkens their complexion to compensate. And of course, if you can manipulate facts to arrive at a basic truth, you can also manipulate facts to arrive at your truth. The assumptions and biases which you personally use to understand the world. Nations used documentaries as propaganda during World War II and the Cold War. Michael Moore selected certain facts and ignored others to present very politically charged documentaries like Fahrenheit 9/11, Bowling for Columbine, and Sicko. And it can go further than political propaganda. Loose Change is a series of incomplete thoughts, half-facts, and conspiracy speculations about the 9/11 terrorist attacks that almost sounds reasonable, since it acts like a documentary. More recently, a film called The Principle tried to argue in favor of geocentrism of all things, and it did so by quoting physicists and astronomers out of context, going on tangents that only appear to have anything to do with the topic, and by actively tricking Kate Mulgrew, aka Captain Janeway, into voicing the narrator. So the next time you watch some apparently clear footage, read the supposed facts, or hear about the unbiased studies, try to avoid assuming that what you're looking at is fact, is indisputable. That's not to say you should paralyze yourself with indecision or assume that nothing at all is true, but to be a good skeptic, you have to at least entertain the thought that everything you think you know is wrong. Thanks for joining me again for today's film review, and I hope you'll join me next time for a film about the most decorated American soldier in World War II, starring himself.